In this video, we're going to talk about how we represent or how we summarize our quantitative data. And once again, the difference between our qualitative and quantitative. The quantitative is going to be these numbers that we see here. And you're going to notice right off the bat that we're going to have to use these slightly different. So here's what we're going to do. We're actually going to kind of walk through the same thing. Now, we actually, instead of calling them frequency tables, we call them frequency distributions. And you'll see why here in a minute, and I'll explain why in a minute. But we're going to follow the same steps that we did for the qualitative data at first. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the profits, and we're going to create frequency distributions, relative frequencies, and then once again, how we represent this graphically in terms of presenting. So I'm going to follow the same steps as I did before. I'm going to go to Insert, and I'm going to go to my pivot table. And once again, as you see, when I created that or when I did that, it highlighted everything. And I'm going to once again use an existing worksheet or the worksheet that I'm currently working on. And I'm going to use that cell G2. So I'm going to follow the same exact steps as I did before. Hopefully you guys got some practice in them. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go and click on profits, right? Now, notice what happened. I clicked on profits, and this is where I mentioned in the first video that when you click on that, sometimes it won't appear in the rows. Sometimes it won't appear at all. In this case, it actually appeared in the values, and where it's not making sense is that it says a sum, because once again, relative frequencies is a count. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to click on this, and I'm going to select my value fields, and I want to do a count, and I'm going to click OK. Now what's missing obviously is the amount of profits. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on that, left click, and drag it down into that rows. And now what you notice is I have all of my profits here. Now, how qualitative data and quantitative data in terms of representing them differ is that with qualitative data, we have specific outcomes, right? We did location before, and we did Tionesta, Sheffield. Now with profits, you notice, look at all of the different profits and their accounts or occurrences, or what we call frequencies. They're basically all happening once. So it just doesn't make sense to do this, because it just doesn't make sense. So what we do is we actually want to create what we call classes, or we're going to group our data together. So there's multiple ways of doing this. There's actually some math behind how we calculate how many classes to create or how many groups to create. But the majority of the time, and I believe in the scenarios that we're given in this class, is that you're told how many times or how many classes. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to just use, we'll say let's create 5 classes, okay, or 5 groups. Now the math I'm going to do though is I want to know how big the classes have to be, or what we call class size. And I'm actually going to use Excel here to create this formula. But class sizes are calculated by taking the maximum value. Now in this case, we're going to learn how to do this a lot quicker, but I'm just going to use Excel as a calculator. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to a cell over here, and I'm going to hit the equal sign, and I'm going to take the maximum value, and I'm going to subtract the minimum value from it, the 294. Now this is what we call the range of our data. So the range is going to be the maximum minus the minimum. So basically what we have between the lowest value and the highest value. So there we have a difference from our highest and lowest value of $2,998. Now in our case, like I said, we will pretty much be given how many classes we want to create. So what I want to do is I want to divvy this 2998 into 5 separate classes. So what I'm going to do is I want to figure out how big that size, or what that class size is, what they represent. So once again, I'm going to use this as a calculator. I'm going to hit the equal sign. I'm going to take our range and divide it by how many classes. And I said, well, we'll use 5, so I'm going to divide it by 5, which actually comes out to $600. Okay, so a difference of $600. So I'm going to use this 600 when grouping. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on my pivot table here, and I'm actually going to left click to get in it, and then I'm going to right click. And what I want to do is as I go, I see this group. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click in this group, and what you'll see is this grouping. We have starting at, we have ending at, and then we have by. So in this case, at this point, it's really up to who's running, who's doing this spreadsheet to really determine, okay, do I want to start at 290? Do I want to start at 295? Do I want to start at 280? Do I want to start at 250? That's really up to the individual. So for me, I like clean numbers. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to start at 290. I don't care what it ends at. Um, so I'm really worried about here about the 600. So I'm going to type in 600 because that's what my class sizes are going to represent is 600. And I'm going to click OK. And now we have our groupings. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We actually have 6. And that's simply because of that the starting point, when we change the starting point and we go by 600 value, because I made the starting point lower, that one that would have fell in this area now falls separate, which is okay. That's totally fine. Okay. So I'm gonna, here's my frequency table. So we actually have groups, class sizes of 600. Profit fell between 290 and 890 14 times. It fell between 890. So now we have a better representation of our data. So this is what we call a frequency distribution table. But once again, it's the very same or exact thing that we did with the qualitative data in the sense of creating a count, how many times those outcomes occur. But once again, because we're dealing with quantitative data, it's going to be a little bit more difficult because we're dealing with ranges of numbers. But this is a good frequency distribution. Now, how we represent frequency distributions, very similar in the sense of our quantitative data. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go and I'm going to create a bar chart. Now, here's where it slightly differs, right? So if I take a look at this, and if you think about our answers, right? So if we look at the bottom here, there's gaps in between our bars. But since we're dealing with quantitative data, the way of looking at the x-axis is that it's a number line. And we shouldn't have a gap in between 890 and 890. These should be combined. So what we want to do is we actually want to close this gap. So how we close this gap is if I'm clicking on my, if I'm inside my chart, what I want to do is I actually want to go into my design tab. So once again, I'm in my chart, I go to my design tab, and there's this quick layout tab that you see. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop that down. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go in here and go 3 rows down and 2 in, and this is what's going to create what's known as a histogram, right? And this really, all it is, it's a bar chart, and what it does is it takes out the gaps or takes away the gaps. And then very similar to what we did before, I want to add my data labels, which is my counts. And then once again, you can kind of make this a lot prettier if you wanted to, but and you can change the titles to make them make sense. But this is a better representation because now, once again, the difference between a bar chart and a histogram is simply the closing of the gaps. So this is how we represent quantitative data when dealing with counts. Okay. Now, on the other aspect, very similar to, and I'm going to delete this, very similar to what we did previously, we can actually, we can also convert these into relative frequencies. So I'm going to do the same thing as we did previously by taking that profits and dropping it down into the values. And once again, we have another count. Well, I don't want to count. I mean, I do want to count, but I want to represent it not as a count, but as a percent of the grand total. And I'm going to click OK. And now we have our relative frequencies, right? So percentage of grand total. And as with the qualitative data, our quantitative data is going to be represented the same way with the relative frequencies in the sense that we're going to create and we're going to show it using a pie chart. So I'm going to do my pie chart. Now I have my pie chart. I'm just going to drop it here. I know it's going to cover some of my data, but And I'm going to add those data labels. And once again, we don't want to count on here, right? We don't care that how many. The whole idea or concept of a pie chart is talking about percentages. So I'm going to click on those, left click on those values, and then right click while they're highlighted. I'm going to format these and I'm going to change it to percentages, get rid of the values, and then I'm going to close that tab. So now I'm left with my percentages. Okay. So as you can see, there is slightly different way that we summarize our quantitative data as compared to our qualitative data. But if you guys have any additional questions on top of this, please let me know. Send me an email and we can kind of talk through this.